You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, show about real-world iOS development. Today with you, your host, Alex Bush. And today is a very interesting topic, and I hope I can kind of get the point across and explain it over the audio format, because it's really something that needs to be shown, because I think it's sort of tricky and complex, but I'll do my best. So what I was doing lately at work is, so I had a ticket that I was working on to implement a section in a home screen, the screen that the user lands on after launching the app, after they signed in, right? The next subsequent launch. It's a tab bar type of app, tab bar navigation app, and the home, quote-unquote, home screen, the first tab is where the user lands on as they launch the app, right? And as of right now, the screen is really static, right? There's nothing, no moving parts there. It just sort of a bunch of shortcuts, if you think about it, to other parts of the app. And as the user taps on them, it navigates them there, right? So there is no data fetched from the backend or anything like that, dynamic changing there. But this new ticket that I was working on, the requirement is to add a new section to that list. It's a sort of a scroll list view with a bunch of sections in it. And again, not a table because nothing is dynamic. And this new section actually has, it's small. It just has, roughly speaking, 2 labels to be displayed with data. And one of them is data coming from the backend. So now, all of a sudden, this thing becomes dynamic, not in a sense of height changing, but in a sense of at runtime, the data displayed needs to be fetched from the backend, right? So there's a networking request involved, and then we need to display data on the screen after the result comes in. So, and while the data is loading, the view is supposed to show sort of its quote-unquote skeleton state. It's basically when the labels and other parts of the UI of that view are kind of grayed out and maybe have a little gray animation showing, kind of like what you would see in YouTube and other apps when you just open the landing page and they didn't load the data yet, and they show you this is sort of a quote-unquote skeleton format of the future views that will have data soon as the network request finishes. And then when it's done, the view is supposed to show the data, right, as it originally is intended. So the tricky part, and what I hope I can explain, sort of the complexity there, which seemingly you would think on the surface, oh, come on, this is so easy, right? It should be like a pretty straightforward thing to do. And the tricky part is this. The requirement for this ticket and for this view, the feature requirement is that it's supposed to refresh again. The data in that view that's displayed supposed to refresh every time when the user sees it, right? So there is no refresh button for that particular section. There is no refresh button for the whole home screen. Every time the user sees it, meaning when the app is launched, right? That's one use case. Then when the user selects, it's a tab bar controller, when the user selects a different tab and then goes back to that home tab, then it needs to be refreshed, right? The data needs to be refreshed and fetched again. But then when, let's say, the user from the home screen, you can push to a different view controller, right, through the navigation controller, so the nav stack. Then when you go back from there, the view is supposed to refresh data again, right? Because that's when the user sees it again, and it might be stale. Then another case is when the user opens the app, maybe is in the home screen, maybe not, then gets back to the home screen and then closes the app, but not the sort of killing the app, right? Because then it's going to relaunch the app, and the app launch sequence kicks in and you refresh through that. But let's say the app is still in memory, right? It's still in the list of whatever it's called, the drawer list of opened apps, right? And then the user switches to another app and then maybe taps on the app icon again to open our app, or opens through the list of currently running apps, right? Back to our app. In either case, if we're still in the home screen, it needs to be, the data needs to be refreshed in that section again, right? But the complexity, so you would think, sort of, all right, like Alex, what's the big deal? The simple solution is use something like view will appear or view did appear callback in the view controller to do that, and it's going to get called when you show the view, right? And that's it, done. Seemingly, I thought so too at first, but then as I start to test those use cases, and there's actually multiple use cases, right? I mean, I already just talked through a bunch, but there is more, and the problem there is you don't want to be fetching data. So what you could do is to just fetch data, roughly speaking, like all the time on all the changes, but then it's going to be a waste, right? And there's several scenarios, and I had to like go kind of a little crazy and draw out like this whole table of the overlapping matching scenarios on when events happen, such as what I was saying, like app is reopened again, or a different screen was pushed and then popped back to that home screen, and in all of those scenarios when you would when you would fetch the data and when you would not fetch the data. So I'll just go through it, and to give you an idea of sort of how many of them there is to take care of. And then in some scenarios you want to fetch data, but in other scenarios, if you keep fetching it, it's actually going to be a waste because the user actually doesn't see the screen, right? So let's see. So again, yeah, I already said the app first launch, right? So that's one case when we want to fetch the data. When we pop back from a navbar controller back to that home screen, that's when we want to fetch the data. When the user selects the tab with the home screen view controller, and it's on the top of the nav stack, we want to refresh it, right? Fetch the data. So that's already 3. But the case when the user selects the home tab again, but the home screen is not at the top of the navigation stack, right? Meaning there was another view controller pushed already on top of the nav stack within the tab bar. I hope that makes sense, right? Because the tab bar that we have, the UI, it's tab bar controller, but then what it consists of is a bunch of navigation bar controllers for each one of the tabs, and within those there is home screen and a home view controller and other view controllers for other tabs. And what could happen is within the tab in the navigation stack, you get other view controllers pushed on the nav stack, right? So then you can go next screen, or then pop the stack, go back to previous, but then all of it is within this one tab, right? Selected. So again, right? And back to this list. So one case is we want to refresh data when the tab is selected and the screen, the home screen, the view controller we care about is at the top of the nav stack. But when the tab is selected, but the view controller is not on the top of the nav stack, we don't care for refreshing because that would be a waste, right? We don't need to make another request and waste bandwidth, waste memory, waste energy, everything on the phone, right? Then another case, app comes to foreground, right? From the background, as I was saying before, and the tab with this view controller is selected, and the view controller, home view controller, is at the top of the navigation stack, meaning it's visible to the user. So in this case, we also want to fetch data and refresh, right? Then app comes from background to foreground, and the right tab is selected where our home view controller lives, but it's not on the nav stack. Again, in this scenario, we do not. It's not at the top of the nav stack. Something else is pushed on top of it. Then we don't want to fetch data. Then another scenario: the app comes back from foreground, but the different tab is selected. And regardless of whether in our home tab, in the nav stack of our home tab, the home view controller was at the top of the nav stack or not, we don't want to be fetching data because the different wrong tab is selected. Then another scenario, sort of a same thing. When the app comes back from foreground, and either the right tab is selected or not, regardless, but let's say it is selected, but then there's a model view controller presented on top of our home view controller that we want to refresh. Same thing. We don't want to be refreshing the data in this case, right? And then same case, app comes back from the foreground, the right tab is selected, but then there's a popover, right? In case of, let's say you're building it for the iPad as well, which in my case that is the case. Then if there's a popover presented, we don't want to be refreshing the view because it's not technically sort of visible, right? But then when presented modally view controller or presented popover, either one of those are dismissed, and the right tab is selected and our home view controller is visible and at the top of the nav stack, right? Then yes, we want to refresh the data. So essentially, as you see, there's so many sort of scenarios and little tricky cases where it's not as straightforward as just calling fetch data and view did appear, because view did appear will not be called in every one of those scenarios. And I'll go through each one of them actually and explain kind of what's going on and what I've done and what are the combinations of signals that I had to use to determine essentially what I'm trying to do here, right? If you think about it, determine the visibility of the view control of the home view controller, right? The one that I'm adding this new section to and where I want to refresh the data. And depending on whether it's visible or not, I want to refresh the data or not do anything. What are all the sort of moving parts here, right, to determine visibility of that view controller? What I wanted to avoid, sort of specifically to make a point avoiding, is to introduce a new state, right? Have some sort of a variable is visible. That's what, if you Google this problem, how to determine or check visibility, or if view controller is visible, you'll get a bunch of articles, Stack Overflow, and so on, mainly talking about, you have a nav stack and check the nav stack for the top view controller. And before iOS 9, I believe, or one of those versions, it was a bit more trickier and difficult. Now, with newer versions, we have sort of improved API, Apple API for that, and there's a visible view controller on the method to be called on the nav stack to get sort of what's visible right now, or stuff like that, right? And what a lot of them actually suggest is to also introduce, if that fails and doesn't work for you, introduce some sort of a state variable, is visible or something like that. You can name it whatever. And when view will appear, view will disappear, and view will appear. One of those methods reassign that flag, that Boolean flag, to true or false, depending on, sort of assumed visibility. That's also error prone, and it's not really correct, if that makes sense, right? It's not precise. So essentially what I narrowed down to is several things. So, and another big thing is that with the whole app dismissal and switching between apps and going to home screen and to home of the phone itself, right? OS, and then going back, tapping on the app icon, or in the app drawer selector, selecting your app back again. That view did appear doesn't account for that, right? Because it's not going to get called again. And I forgot how the API states it. The API documentation for view did appear and view will appear calls, but I believe it's something along the lines of when the view of that view controller or that view controller is about to or was added to the view hierarchy or something like that, right? So, which means when you dismiss the app and show it again, that's not happening. So view did appear and view will appear won't get called, which means the only thing that we can utilize in this case is actually observation for observe app wide notification for foreground and background changes, right? So you utilize NS notification center and then observe on when the app gets into the foreground, meaning presented to the user again, or gets that's essentially that. So there's that. Then view did appear because it is useful in most of the scenarios, or at least the obvious scenarios of pushing and popping the nav stack. And then there's a tab bar index, right? So what I utilized was tab bar index of the currently selected tab bar. That's also not as good because you kind of have to tie it to specific index of your tab bar, and I'm sure you can improve it by sort of checking on the presented or tab bars view controller, but in my case it's a UI navigation stack, so I just didn't bother to do that. And then there's a visible view controller in the nav bar, right, of your selected tab bar. Again, I hope I'm not losing you guys. It's just so many things to kind of explain over the audio. So, and basically my determination of the visibility, essentially if the view controller is visible or not, it would be is the right tab bar selected? So I'm checking that tab bar index. And then is the visible view controller is itself or not, right? Because I'm checking it inside of the my home view controller, right? In cases when I'm going off of the screen, right? So, okay, let's go through it. So first app launch. Do we want to fetch data? Yes. Does view did appear call gets called? Yes, it will get called. And that's where we check, is the view controller visible? Yes, it is visible because the tab bar selected has the right index that we want. And then in the navigation bar, visible view controller is that view controller, that home view controller. So that means it is visible, and we will fetch the data. We'll make the call. The foreground, background observation is not involved. Then the next one, pop back from the other view controller pushed on the nav stack back to that home view controller. Do we want to fetch the data? Yes, we do. Will view did appear will it get called? Yes, it will get called. And then we check, is it visible, right? Is our home view controller visible? In this case, yes, it is visible because the selected tab bar again is correct, of the correct index, and then the visible view controller is the home view controller, right? Then another case, the user selects a different tab and then selects back and goes back, selects again the tab bar where our home view controller is. Do we want to fetch data? Yes. Will view did appear get called? Yes, it gets called. When we check visibility, is it visible? Yes, it's visible because it's, again, same scenario. It's the right tab bar selected and the visible view controller is our home view controller. Then let's say the user is in the home tab, right? Next case. And then the user selects something in the UI that it pushes a new view controller in that tab onto the nav stack. Then the user selects a different tab and then goes back to that tab where the home view controller is. Do we want to fetch data in this case? No, we don't, right? Because currently the home view controller is not visible. There is another one pushed onto the nav stack on top of it, and that other view controller is visible. So first of all, we won't be doing, in this scenario, we won't be doing the check in the, we won't be doing the check in the first place because view did appear actually will not be called in this scenario. So the Apple's API is smart enough to do that. But even if it was called, right, our visibility check will not go through because, yes, the selected tab bar index is 0, but then the visible view controller is not going to be that home view controller. It's going to be the view controller pushed onto the nav stack on top of it, right? So the check won't go through. So we're good. The next case, right? The app comes to the foreground, right? Again, we dismissed the user dismissed the app and went to another app and then came back to our app. Do we want to fetch the data in this case? Yes, because in this case, and assuming that when the user comes back to our app, the right tab bar is selected and our view controller that we want to refresh is the one at the top of the nav stack, right? Meaning visible. Do we want to fetch data in this case? Yes, we want to fetch data in this case, but we cannot rely on view did appear call because it won't be called. In this scenario, the system doesn't call that callback, right? Instead, we need to observe that foreground notification, right? Foreground change notification. And from there, we check, is our view controller visible? In this case, yes, the selected tab bar is correct, and the visible view controller is that view controller, that home view controller. So visibility check goes through, and after that, we call our refresh code, right? Refresh data code. Then another scenario. Again, app comes back from the foreground, but in this scenario, let's say the user had the first tab selected, right? The right tab, but there was a navigation view controller pushed on top of our home view controller in the navigation stack. Same thing, right? We can't rely on view did appear because it won't be called. In this scenario, we rely on the foreground notification. It will trigger our check. Our visibility check will not go through because the view controller is not visible. Selected tab is correct, but the visible view controller is not going to be ours. It's going to be another one that's on top of the nav stack. Then another case. App, again, the foreground cases. App comes back from the background to foreground, but the other tab is selected, right? Not the one in which our view controller is. And it's regardless of whether our view controller within that tab is on the top of the nav stack or not. In either case, we don't want to be fetching data. In either case, view did appear will not be called for it because it's the foreground app change, right, rather than this individual view controller's event. But in either case, we'll get the notification in our view controller to check notification about app coming back to the foreground, but then visibility check in either scenario won't get through, because in both cases the selected tab will be incorrect, and in one case our visible view controller is going to be the one, our view controller, or it's going to be another one on top of it in the nav stack. In either case though, the check doesn't go through, view controller is not visible. Another case, app comes from the foreground, from the background to foreground again, but our view controller is covered by a pop over, right? In case of an iPad. Do we want to fetch data? No, not really. Will view did appear get called? It will not get called. The foreground app coming to foreground notification will get called, and it will trigger the visibility check. And the visibility check in this case, well, if we're in the right tab, yes, the index of the tab will match, but then visible view controller actually is going to be it's gonna say no, that our view controller is not visible, so your visibility check will not go through. Okay, then similar case, app comes to foreground from the background when covered by a modally presented view controller. Right, our home tab's view controller is covered by modal view controller. Same thing. Do we want to fetch data? No, we don't. The check for fetch will get triggered by the app coming to foreground notification, and the visibility check will fail regardless of whether selected tab bar index is correct or not. In one case, yes, it might be true. In other cases, false. But then the visible view controller is not going to be at the top of the nav stack. So our view controller is not going to be at the top of the nav stack, so the visible view controller check will not go through. So overall, it's not visible. Then another case, I have a few more to go. When there was a model presented on top of our view controller, our home view controller in the right tab, and then it's dismissed, right? And our model view control, our home view controller is shown again, right? It's visible again to the user. Do we want to fetch data? Yes, but there is no foreground notification involved, of course. It's not related in this case. And will view did appear get called? Actually, in this case, unlike with popping the nav stack or switching between selected tabs, view did appear is not called. So unfortunately, in this case, we have to utilize something like callback closure for dismissing the modally presented view controller. But then, if you're sort of running the same code in that callback through delegates or whatever you use, or callback blocks as well, your visibility check and it will go through again because it's the right selected tab bar index, and then the visible view controller is that home tab bar view controller, right? So, and similar scenario for the pop over that's shown over our home view controller, right? Do we want to fetch data when it's dismissed? Yes, we do. Will the foreground notification will be involved? No. Will view did appear will be called in our home view controller? Actually, it won't. Unfortunately, again, unlike with the navbar stack, so pop of the nav stack. So, but you'll have to utilize callbacks, right? The closure completion blocks for dismissing the pop over. But visibility check will go through. It's the right index, and then the visible view controller is going to be our home view controller at the top of the nav stack. But, and then another case, right, when we dismiss modally presented view controller, but in the right tab bar where our home view controller is, but if it's not on the top of the nav stack, let's say you had your home view controller in that tab, you clicked something and it pushed another another view controller on top of it in the nav stack, and then you clicked something and then it presented something else modally on top of it. So in this case, when you dismiss that modal, we don't want to be fetching data because our home view controller is not visible to the user, and the checks for visibility won't go through because yes, the tab bar is correct, but then visible view controller in that nav bar is not our home view controller. And same goes for another use case. The last use case is dismissing presented popover. When our view controller, again, same thing, is not top of the nav stack, same scenario, right? The visibility won't go through and view did appear will not be called for either of them. So yeah, guys, this is, I hope I didn't lose you. It's very, very difficult to explain over the audio. But if you want to be really thorough with your sort of when to call your refresh code, right, and be very precise, this is kind of the scenarios you have to cover and orchestrate, right? At the end of the day, it's not that difficult, really. It's the view did appear is one of your triggers, and then app foreground notification change, right, is another trigger. And based on those two, every time, roughly speaking, every time they're called, you check, is my view controller visible or not? And if it is, I fetch the data, and if it's not, I don't do anything. Another exception to it, though, is the dismissing modally presented view controllers on top of your stuff, your home view controller, and presented popovers. Sort of, you don't get either the app foreground notification trigger or view did appear trigger, so you have to rely on the callback blocks or some other methods, but callback blocks seem to be the best. So yeah, guys, there's actually this table that I was kind of mentioning at the top of the show with sort of all these overlapping cases and scenarios and flags where I color-coded stuff for like green and red when something's true or false. That I'll add it to show notes so you can take a look and see kind of the length that I went to for that. It might not be necessary for you, right? That sort of feels like too much work for this thing. But if you, again, want to be really thorough and concerned about your users' kind of memory use, bandwidth use, CPU, and everything else, which you most of the time should be when you're making apps, then this is kind of what you want to go through. And let me know. Maybe I've done too much for this, right? Like it could have been way easier to go about it some other way, and I'm kind of missing something. So let me know how you handled stuff like that and scenarios like that to determine when to refresh, or when a view controller became visible or not, essentially, right? And leave me a note, email me about it, or maybe a tweet or something like that. And I would love to learn new ways of doing it. But that's it for today. You can reach me at hello@InsideIOSDev, and you can DM me or tweet at me on Twitter at InsideIOSDev, and I'll see you next time.